Jason here. Welcome to Founder of the Day, Federalist number 10. We are on our 10th read along, where we will be going line by line through the Federalist Papers, this time number 10, one of the most famous, most important, primarily because James Madison shows up. So far, we've heard a good amount from John Jay, though that won't happen again for a while, and Alexander Hamilton, who's been questionable in his arguments. Now we come to James Madison. Why don't we get right over here and pull it on up. Federalist number 10. The same subject continued. The Union as a safeguard against domestic faction and insurrection for the New York Packet. November 23rd, 1787, by little Jemmy Madison. Now, this is the first time Madison shows up. I'm going to say right away, it's very interesting that he's basically finishing a subject Hamilton started. Hamilton, as I said, we've discussed the first few were a little bit questionable. And now James Madison's coming in to say, Hammy, let me do this right. So here we go. As always, it's addressed to the people of the state of New York. And as always, there is a link in the description below if you'd like to read along with me, exactly as we see on the screen here. Again, as per usual, I will be highlighting line by line. As I've found, some of the sentences are pretty easy to understand. Some of them are very difficult and we have to break them down. So that's what we'll do here. So what does James Madison have to say about domestic insurrection? Among the numerous advantages promised by a well-constructed union, none deserves to be more accurately developed than its tendency to break and control the violence of faction. Right off the bat, well-constructed, one word, his word, not mine. I would have made those two words. So there are so many advantages of putting together a unified nation, but none deserves to be more accurately developed. So none should really be spoken about at length more than the ability to break and control violence of faction. Now, faction is a word they used for parties back then. Basically what we would call political parties, though it could have other meanings. Just the separation into groups. Now, in this paper, if my memory serves me correctly, he is going to mostly be speaking of faction as both separate states, state versus state, and the ideology versus ideology. And a union, to break separate ideologies, is what he's going for. He wants unification. The friend of popular governments never finds himself so much alarmed for their character and fate as when he contemplates their propensity to this dangerous vice. So, popular governments, Democratic or Republican governments, as they would say it at the time, people who like Republican governments or Democratic governments should be most afraid of how there is a tendency, as he said in the last sentence, for factions to form, for political parties to form. Again, if you're new here, I try not to talk about modern politics at all, although with some of the Federalist Papers, it's a dangerous dance I'm playing. He will not fail, therefore, to set a due value on any plan which, without violating the principles to which he is attached, provides a proper cure for it. So, he, being the person who's contemplating this dangerous vice that is party faction, will set a due value on any plan which, without violating the principles to which he is attached, provides a cure for it. So, if you're concerned about Republican free governments, you should think about this a little bit. As long as you're not violating your own ideals, you should try and come up with a way to correct the problem. And I bet you James Madison's going to try. So, the insatiability, injustice, and confusion introduced into the public councils have, in truth, been the mortal diseases under which popular governments have everywhere perished, as they continue to be the favorite and fruitful topics from which the adversaries to liberty derive their most specious declamation. So, break down that complicated sentence. When parties and factions arise within a government, it leads to, as he says, instability, injustice, and confusion at the highest levels of government. And he calls it a mortal disease. It's exactly this that makes free governments disappear and be taken advantage of, because it's just these topics, these injustices and these confusions that as what he calls the adversaries of liberty, or people who are trying to grab power for themselves. It's exactly what they use to overthrow popular governments. Okay, this is a little bit of a lengthy sentence here. The valuable improvements made by the American constitutions on the popular models, both ancient and modern, cannot certainly be too much admired. But it would be an unwarrantable partiality to contend that they have as effectually obviated the danger on this side as was wished and expected. So what he's saying is the state constitutions are really good, building off both ancient free governments and modern ones. He did have contemporaries, Netherlands, certain places in what we would call Italy today. So there were republics, Geneva, they're around. So he's saying the constitutions that the states have are improved upon those, which shout out to John Adams, who influenced many of them. And he admires that, but it isn't getting rid of all the dangers like we want to. And I will say, right off the bat, Madison, his language is already a lot more friendly to his audience than Hamilton's. Hamilton's a little aggressive. He talks down to people. Madison's, no, you did a good job writing these state governments. Good job, guys. Good job. You're really trying your best. Okay, this is a really long sentence here. Complaints are everywhere heard from our most considerate and virtuous citizens, equally the friends of public and private faith, and of public and personal liberty, that our governments are too unstable, that the public good is disregarded in the conflicts of rival parties, and that measures are too often decided not according to the rules of justice and the rights of the minor party, but by the superior force of an interested and overbearing majority. Okay. Complaints are everywhere heard. So upright citizens all over the place don't like certain things that are going on. They are complaining about it. They are friends of liberty, but they're nervous that these governments aren't good enough to overbear rival parties. He literally says rival parties within the state governments. It is impeding, in his estimation, the prosperity of many nations, or not nations, many of the states. Not, as he says, not according to the rules of justice and the rights of the minor party. So he's by the superior force of an overbearing majority. And here we start to get into what James Madison is best known for, other than being president, and it is defense of the minority. He is saying, like, not factions arise, that's fine, but when factions arise, and it's usually the faction with the most people that does harm to the faction with less people, whether purposely or impurposely. He hasn't really specified that. However anxiously we may wish that these complaints had no foundation, the evidence of known facts will not permit us to deny that they are in some degree true. So we don't want this to be the case. We don't want there to be factions in the state governments. We don't want the majority in the state governments to be oppressing the minority in the state governments, but they are. And we need to find a way to fix this problem. Another long sentence. And this is a long paragraph too, longer than John Jay or James or Alexander Hamilton writes. James Madison comes out real long. It will be found indeed on a candid review of our situation that some of the distresses under which we have been 18th century language, that's why we do this. It will be found indeed on a candid review of our situation that some of the distresses under which we labor have been erroneously charged on the operation of our governments, but it will be found at the same time that other causes will not alone account for many of our heaviest misfortunes, and particularly for that prevailing and increasing distrust of public engagements and alarm for private rights, which are echoed from one end of the continent to the other. Breaking that down. So, candid review. So, if we look, with an open mind and unbiased look, many of the problems we see happening in these state governments, it's not just the government that's a problem. And part of the misfortune is the distrust of the government from the people. The people of the states are distrusting their state governments, and that's caused alarm for private rights. This is essentially a shout out to Shays Rebellion. Because Shays Rebellion, they didn't trust the government, and the wealthy people were nervous that the regular people were coming for their land and everything, when truthfully the people just wanted, these Revolutionary War veterans wanted to keep their land. I'm not going to go off on Shays Rebellion. We can talk about that another time. These must be chiefly, if not wholly, effects of the unsteadiness and injustice with which a factious spirit has tainted our public administrations. So he's saying that this distrust of government, the Shays rebels, it's not even their fault. It's that the people, they're factions, and that is true. There were not only Shays Rebellion in Massachusetts, but New Hampshire, several other states at this point had, if not full-on rebellions, at least real issues with the government, and there were party politics. And that's the thing. It was, it sounds like modern garbage, but it was the coastal elites in Boston were the ones Shays rebels were angry at. And it's that Madison is saying that it's those factions, those parties that have split up in the state governments that are making the state constitutions unstable. Okay, let's see. One long run-on paragraph. By a faction, I understand a number of citizens, whether amounting to a majority or a minority of the whole, who are united and actuated by some common impulse of passion or of interest adverse to the rights of other citizens, or to the permanent and aggregate interests of the community. So right here, James Madison is defining, I think of that word, defining what he means by the word faction. And this is extraordinarily important. This might be the most important sentence we read throughout the Federalist Papers, because the Federalist Papers are the foundation of American political thought. And Federalist number 10 and 51 are the two that really get pointed to. So this particular sentence is extraordinarily important. I'm going to read it again. This is James Madison. By faction, I understand a number of citizens, whether amounting to a majority or a minority of the whole, who are united and actuated by some common impulse of passion or of interest adverse to the rights of other citizens or to the permanent and aggregate interests of the community. So when he says faction, when we talk about faction, and sometimes I'll use the word party interchangeably because that's how we consider it today, he means people in a state or underneath a government, and he says either the majority or a minority. So a group of people under a government who are united by one either passion or interest. They have one thing in common, but what they want is adverse to either the rights of other people or the interests of the community as a whole. So that does differentiate from how we consider the word party today. Today we consider party, we're on the same team, but we're not out to get other people. We don't want to hurt the rights of other people. We just want to protect our own rights. That's at least how we generally think of it today, if that's maybe not how it comes off in practice sometimes. Madison specifically thinks, I want for me, and yes, it's going to hurt someone else, but I don't care. And yes, it might hurt our country in the long run, but I don't care. To be fair, I mean, again, I don't talk about modern politics here, but it's not, I'll leave it at that. So again, this is really important, his definition, that it involves wanting something, a group of people who want something that is going to adversely affect either another group of people or the community as a whole. There are two methods of curing the mischiefs of faction. The one by removing its causes, the other by controlling its effects. So that's pretty easy to understand. We want to get rid of faction. We can do one of two things. We can either get rid of the things that cause factions, or we can understand they happen and try and mitigate the outcome. There are, again, two methods of removing the causes of faction. The one, by destroying the liberty which is essential to its existence. The other, by giving to every citizen the same opinions, the same passions, the same interest. So, Again, this is another really important sentence in the Federalist Papers pantheon. As he said, you can either get rid of what makes faction, or you can get rid of what happens. So the causes of faction, his understanding, the reason parties, or to stop the causes of faction, to stop the need for parties, you can either get rid of liberty, which, as he says, is essential to its existence. So if people don't have any freedoms, then they can't have political parties. Or give everyone the same opinion, passion, and interest. Make everyone essentially a clone of each other. So that's how you get rid of the causes. Let's see what he thinks of that. It could never be more truly said than of the first remedy that it was worse than the disease. So he says getting rid of people's freedoms so that we don't have political parties, that's worse than having political parties. Let's just get rid of that. Okay? Liberty is to faction what air is to fire, an ailment without which it instantly expires. So, just like a fire needs oxygen to keep burning, factions need liberty to keep going. Oh, is this so long? But it could not be less folly to abolish liberty, which is essential to political life, because it nourishes faction, than it would be to wish the annihilation of air, which is essential to animal life because it imparts to fire its destructive agency. So right here, Madison saying, sure, one of the causes of political parties is freedom, because people are free to join teams and choose sides. But we're not going to get rid of air and all suffocate because air causes fire. That's an overreaction. And we need to think the same way about liberty in association with political parties. So the second expedient. And I'm going to go back up just to remind us what it is. By giving every citizen the same opinion. So he's about to talk about, again, we're talking about the causes of political parties. The second expedient is as impracticable as the first would be unwise. So the first is dumb. Getting rid of freedom so we don't have political parties is dumb. Now he's saying giving everyone exactly the same opinion so we don't have political parties is essentially impossible. So James Madison, please elaborate. As long as the reason of man continues fallible and he is at liberty to exercise it, difference opinion will form. So people are people and we make mistakes. And as long as we're people and we make mistakes and we're free people, we're going to have differences of opinion. That's just going to happen. As long as the connection subsists between his reason and his self-love, his opinions and his passions will have a reciprocal influence on each other. And the former will be the objects to which the latter will attach themselves. So we're free people. We have the ability to make up our mind. We will use reason. He says self-love, but I think what we would call self-interest nowadays, or even back then they usually called it self-interest. You will have passions that inform your opinions. You're passionate about something, and that helps you make your opinion, because we're free people. The diversity in the faculties of men from which the rights of property originate is not less an insuperable obstacle to a uniformity of interest. Threw me off there. This should be an uniformity of interest, James Madison, because it's a U. Putting grammar aside, the diversity of faculties of men. So there's lots of people who have lots of different thoughts and opinions. The rights of property originate is not less an insuperable obstacle in the uniformity of interest. So because we have different opinions, that's where the rights of property originate. That's strange. I'm going to blow past that for a second. We'll come back to that at the end. The protection of these faculties is the first object of government. So the protection of so James Madison outright saying here, the reason we have government is to give people the freedom to be themselves. That's the whole point of a Republican or democratic government, a free government, as they often called it at the time. The whole point is to give people the ability to have liberty and be whoever they want to be. From the protection of different and unequal faculties of acquiring property, the possession of different degrees and kinds of property immediately results, and from the influence of these on the sentiments and views of the respective proprietors ensues a division of the society into different interests and parties. So he keeps bringing up property here. The protection of different and unequal faculties of oh, okay. So we're all different people. We have freedoms to go about our lives differently. But because we're different, it means we can acquire property differently. Again, property was important back then. We think life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. That's Thomas Jefferson's real great contribution to humanity. It's because that line was commonly said at the time from John Locke, which is life, liberty, and property. And Thomas Jefferson's great contribution is changing property to pursuit of happiness. That being said, they still very much were concerned with property. And what he's essentially saying here is we're different people, means we can acquire property differently, and since we have different access to property, we're at different places in society, and therefore we have different interests, and political parties arise. Okay. The latent causes of faction are thus sown in the nature of man, and we see them everywhere brought into different degrees of activity according to the different circumstances of civil society. So just to recap, Madison said we can either, if we don't want political parties, we can either get rid of the causes of the political parties, or we could try and rein in the parties themselves. He just went through what he believes are the two causes of parties. People's freedom, which you don't want to restrict, and the other cause, he went through the causes and to the solutions. One is people's freedoms, and we can't restrict that. And one is that to get everyone to you need everyone to think exactly the same. And he's like, that's literally impossible. So we can't actually get rid of factions, or as we call them today, political parties. You just can't. It, as he says here, it's sown in the nature of man. So what do we do about it, James Madison? Okay, this seems to be a very long sentence. We might have to break this one down a little bit more, but that's okay. A zeal for different opinions concerning religion, concerning government, and many other points, as well as speculation as of practice, an attachment to different leaders, ambitiously contending for preeminence and power, or to persons of other descriptions whose fortunes have been interesting to the human passions, have, in turn, divided mankind into parties, inflamed them with mutual animosity, and rendered them much more disposed to vex and oppress each other than to cooperate for their common good. So James Madison, being bleaker than Alexander Hamilton's been to this point, which is pretty impressive. Their views on human nature seem to be pretty harsh. He's basically saying here, we're free, so we're different. We have different religions. We have different ideas for what government should have. We have different, even if we have the same idea on a religion or government, the way it's carried out, we have different opinions on the operation, which is different. And that leads to people trying to get their way and therefore vie for power. And that creates animosity and anger. And as he says here at the end, it renders them much more disposed to vex and oppress each other than to cooperate for their common good. So James Madison has concluded that parties are natural, factions are natural, and human beings are more disposed to oppress each other than cooperate for the good. Okay. Great. Thanks a lot, James. Really giving us a good night. So strong is this propensity of mankind to fall into mutual animosities that where no substantial occasion presents itself, the most frivolous and fanciful distinctions have been sufficient to kindle their unfriendly passions and excite their most violent conflicts. So not only are people happy to oppress each other and not work together, but it's so built into our systems. And by system, I mean like our habits as humans, that even if there was no like real reason to get into a fight, we'll find a reason. Frivolous, the most frivolous and fanciful distinctions. It's a really nice way to put it. And it excites their most violent conflicts. Okay. But James got a solution, I bet. We'll get there. But the most common and durable source of factions has been the various and unequal distribution of property. The most common and durable source of factions has been the various and unequal distributions of properties, bringing property back up. And he's saying the reason is that not everyone has the same stuff. It's interesting. Equal distribution of wealth is not really an idea that anyone even spoke about for about 50 years later. Karl Marx writes 50 years after this. So talking about the distribution of property is really fascinating here in this document, which I will repeat is one of the foundations of American political thought. This is one of the most important documents ever written when it comes to American political thought under the Constitution. Continue. Those who hold and those who are without property have ever formed distinct interests in society. So the wealthy who have and the commoners who have not are of different parties, and they have different interests and different goals. Pretty easy to understand. Those who are creditors and those who are debtors fall under a like discrimination. Now, you might think, okay, the creditors are the rich people and the debtors are the poor people. That's not actually true. This is actually more of a north-south thing. Oh, that's not even entirely true. Many of the wealthiest elites in American society at the time were debtors. Look, like Thomas Jefferson dies in serious debt. Many American founders have serious debts. But he's pointing out that these are different natural segments of society that will have different political goals and therefore fall into different factions or parties. A landed interest, a manufacturing interest, a mercantile interest, a moneyed interest, with many lesser interests, grow up of necessity in civilized nations and divide them into different classes actuated by different sentiments and views. So again, he's just further elaborating his point here. But people who own a lot of land will have different goals than their wealthy neighbors who own a factory. Will have different interests than their neighbors who own a ship and their neighbors who own, a bank. And then, the rabble. The regulations of these various and interfering interests forms the principal task of modern legislation and involves the spirit of party and faction in the necessary and ordinary operations of government. So there are these interests, we acknowledge them, and that is, he says, the principal task of government. He had earlier said the task of government is to ensure everyone has their freedom. And now he's saying it's legislation that will regulate these various people, these various interests and parties and factions. So therefore, we need to find a nice common ground. We need to regulate different segments of society so that everyone can have the same access to equality, or at least freedom. Not necessarily equality, but equality of opportunity. So just to recap, Madison has pointed out people are terrible. There are going to be parties, and we need a government to make sure that parties are not oppressing any individual. Take a quick sip of water here because I'm doing a lot of talking. Thank you for your patience. No man is allowed to be a judge in his own cause, because his interest would certainly bias his judgment and not probably corrupt his integrity. So you can't be if you're in a court case, you can't be the judge because you're obviously going to vote for yourself. Pretty easy. With equal, nay, with greater reason, a body of men are unfit to be both judges and parties at the same time. Yet, what are many of the most important acts of legislation, but so many judicial determinations, not indeed concerning the rights of single persons, but concerning the rights of large bodies of citizens. So, again, Not only can you not be your own judge, but a group of people can't be judges of themselves. But what are many important acts of legislation? What are governments doing? They are making judicial determinations. That it's interesting. It's really interesting that he's saying the legislature is the judicial department, because the judicial department is a different section. Though in the Constitution, we should note, there's not a whole lot written about the judicial department. It's basically left up to Congress to create. But again, that's not necessarily what we're talking about here. I just found that interesting. But not indeed. Okay, so it's not one person deciding for themselves, like I'm a judge of my own case. It's a group of people being adjudged for the whole nation. Okay. And what are the different classes of legislators, what are the different classes of legislators, but advocates and parties to the cause which they determine? So, okay, so we can't be judges of ourselves, but every legislature is part of a party. It happens naturally. Is a law proposed concerning private debts? Okay. It is a question to which the creditors... Okay, so this is kind of one sentence with this question mark in the middle. Is a law proposed concerning private debts? It is a question to which the creditors are parties on one side and the debtors on the other. So if you're making a law about debt, well, you're going to have creditors and debtors who are on opposite sides of that. Justice ought to hold a balance between them. So it should be somewhere in the middle. Yet the parties are and must be themselves the judges. And the most numerous party, or, in other words, the most powerful faction, must be expected to prevail. So if you have debtors and creditors both in the government and you're making a law about debts, and there's more debtors than creditors, the law is going to favor the debtors. And therefore, the more powerful party with the more people is going to essentially impose rule that could restrict the rights of the creditors in this scenario. Shall domestic manufacturers be encouraged, and in what degree by the restrictions on foreign manufacturers? Are questions which would be differently decided by the landed and manufacturing classes, and probably by neither, with a sole regard to justice and the public good. So he's essentially making the same point we just made with manufacturers and landowners. The apportionment of taxes on the various descriptions of property is an act which seems to require the most exact impartiality. Yet there is, perhaps, no legislative act in which greater opportunity and temptation are given to a predominant party to trample the rules of justice. So taxes are the best example. It should be done totally impartially. You should apportion it evenly. But when you're making tax laws, it is the best time for whatever party has the most people to take advantage and get as much power for themselves as they can. Every shilling with which they overburden the inferior number is a shilling saved to their own pockets. So if the rich people put taxes on the poor, then the rich people get to save money. And vice versa. If the poor people put the taxes on the rich, then the poor people get to save money. Okay, we will be getting to James Madison's solution soon. I have a feeling it has to do with the Constitution. It is in vain to say that enlightened statesmen will be able to adjust these clashing interests and render them all subservient to the public good. This is very interesting. It is vain to say that enlightened statesmen, they get in later, somewhere in like the 30s or 40s of the Federalist Papers, they write about enlightened statesmen and how the U.S. Senate is supposed to be statesmen versus the House of Representatives is supposed to be common people. Kind of like the House of Lords and Commons in England. But here he's saying it's vain to say that statesmen are enlightened and will be above all this because they are statesmen. No, they will also find parties. They will also have interests that are their own. Enlightened statesmen will not always be at the helm. Fair enough. Looking to the future, not everyone who takes power is going to be an enlightened statesman. We might get a Warren Harding every once in a while. Nor, in many cases, can such an adjustment be made at all without taking into view indirect and remote considerations, which will rarely prevail over the immediate interest which one party may find in disregarding the rights of another or the good of the whole. So you can't necessarily fly by your seat of the pants when you're making decisions of this nature, because very rarely will people decide, hey, this is, as he was saying before, we might affect either other people or the good of the whole. So this is the cause. So the inference to which we are brought is that the causes of faction cannot be removed, and that relief is only to be sought in the means of controlling its effects. This, I know this sentence earlier I said is probably the most important we're going to read. This is up there with one of the most important sentences in political thought and how the United States has trended politically for 250 years. I'm going to read it again. The inference to which we are brought is that the causes of faction cannot be removed, and that relief is only to be sought in the means of controlling the effects. So, to translate, because of what I, James Madison, have just said, we have to conclude that the causes of faction cannot be removed. There will be parties, there will be factions. Humanity is built in that nature. And the only thing we can do to remedy the problem of faction is to control the effects of it. To acknowledge there will be parties and acknowledge there will be factions, but try and rein them in as best we can so they don't impede on the rights of individuals. It's interesting because you hear people talk a lot about, like, the founders didn't want us to have parties or factions. It's like James Madison's literally in one of the most important Federalist papers saying we're gonna have them. But what do we do about it? Okay. So, real quick sip of water. I'm sorry. Whip and whistle. Okay. If a faction consists of less than a majority, relief is supplied by the Republican principle, which enables the majority to defeat its sinister views by regular vote. So if the minority party wants to oppress the majority party, that's just not going to happen because the majority party is going to be like, no, get out of here. Yeah, at least in a republic with the votes, obviously if it was like a, never mind, I'm not going to get into it. He very specifically says in a republic where you can vote. It may clog the administration, it may convulse the society, but it will be unable to execute and mask its violence under the forms of the Constitution. So the minority party can stop the executive branch from doing what it has to. It can screw up society, essentially by voting no. Now, I don't want to make a reference to modern politics. I try my best not to, but as we, turn on the TV, and I will note, actually, this is interesting, super side note, and don't want to be the guy who brings it up the Nazi party, but one of the things, the Weimar Republic in Germany in the 1930s was essentially a republic, but what happened was they had a bunch of political parties, but the Nazi faction, they went in and just voted no on everything, and the government ground to a halt. And that's essentially kind of what, then like they had to get, eventually the agreement was, well, we'll let Hitler be chancellor, and then the Nazis were like, cool, we'll go for that. And that's essentially what Madison is predicting here. You can convulse society. A minority party can do a lot of damage to the good of the whole if it wants to. But it will be able to unexecute it. It cannot execute its violence. It cannot execute its terrible minority plan. And it will not be able to mask it under the Constitution. We will see it happening. And that is one of the Madison starting to prove points on why the Constitution will remedy this. When a majority is included in a faction, the form of popular government, on the other hand, enables it to sacrifice its ruling passion or interests, both the public good and the rights of other citizens. Let me say, I don't know if I read that right. When a majority is included in a faction, so when the larger party, the form of popular government, on the other hand, enables it to sacrifice its ruling passion or interest, both the public good and the rights of other citizens. I'm sorry, I'm having trouble with this one. When the larger party in a free government. The larger party sacrifices the minority party's beliefs. Okay, that's what he's saying there. That's why I was a little confused. That was written a little bit. Okay. To secure the public good and private rights against the danger of such a faction. Oh, no, I'm sorry. Okay, go back here. Hey, it's been a few months since I read this. Bear with me. It's tough. 18th century language, right? So he's saying a majority can sacrifice its interest to the public good and rights of other citizens. The majority party can do what it wants, essentially. So to secure the public good and private rights against the dangers of such a faction, and at the same time to preserve the spirit and form of popular government, is then the great object to which our inquiries are directed. So here we have come to the grand conclusion of what needs to be done. When a majority party is in power, how do we keep it from destroying either the community for its own passions and own, interests and greed, and how do we keep it from oppressing the minority? So again, this is like the heart of American political thought. James Madison's come to the conclusion that there are going to be parties, there are going to be bigger parties and smaller parties. The bigger party can oppress the minority party. How do we stop that from happening? Let me add that it is the great, that's a tough word, desideratum, okay, well, not even going to pretend to know what that word means. Let me add that it is the great desideratum by which this form of government can be rescued from the opprobrium under which it has so long labored, and be recommended to the esteem and adoption of mankind. So, this is the scenario that the state governments, again, he was talking about the state governments earlier, and so when he's saying this, we've been under this rule for such a long time, which has been like less than a decade, but the state governments are in this situation where the majority parties are starting to oppress minority parties, and that's why you see violence break out at Shays' Rebellion, the paper money riots in New Hampshire. Popular sentiment has been getting a little out of hand. So here we are. This is the situation. James Madison, tell us what to do. By what means is the object attainable? Evidently by one of two only. So how can we solve this problem? And he says there are two solutions. We can do one of these two things. Either the existence of the same passion or interest in a majority at the same time must be prevented, or the majority having such coexistent passions or interests must be rendered by their number and local situation unable to concert and carry into effect schemes of oppression. So, as we said earlier, there are going to be majority parties, there are going to be minority parties. To prevent the majority party from oppressing the individual liberties of the minority, we either have to make sure no majority party has the same interests, so they which I'm sure he's going to say is impossible, or because he's already said there's a majority party based on the same interests. So we got to stop them from having the same interests, or we need to separate them throughout the community so that they can't actually work together on such a large scale to do the oppressing. Okay. If the impulse and the opportunity be suffered to coincide, we well know that neither moral nor religious motives can be relied on as an adequate control. So, moral and religious motives, like, we can't just say, God thinks you shouldn't oppress people. People are not going to listen to that. Oops, whoa, here we go. Slow it down, buddy. They are not found to be on such they are not found to be such on the injustice and violence of individuals, and lose their efficacy in proportion to the number combined together. That is, in proportion as their efficacy becomes needful. So they'll only get together in these large groups when they really have to get what they want. All right. From this view of the subject, it may be concluded that a pure democracy, by which I mean a society consisting of a small number of citizens who assemble and administer the government in person, can admit of no cure of the mischiefs of faction. Fascinating sentence here. He's essentially referencing ancient democracies, where he literally says, a pure democracy where everyone goes to the courtyard and we all raise our hands and vote and look each other in the eyes and run our small little town, that community will have factions, and you cannot stop the majority. If there's a group of 10 children making a decision and 7 of them want something, the other 3, they're getting their rights taken away. If they all want to shoot spitballs at those 3 kids, they can, and there's nothing those kids can do about it. A common passion or interest will, in almost every case, be felt by a majority of the whole. A communication and concert result from the form of government itself, and there is nothing to check the inducements to sacrifice the weaker party or an obnoxious individual. Didn't realize they called people obnoxious back then. But what he's saying here, common passion and interest in almost every case. So whenever there's a government of people, those people, the majority of them, will to some degree still have certain agreements, still have certain things. Again, I don't like to talk about modern politics, but we all drive on the right-hand side of the road. And if someone holds the door first, most of us say please, or thank you. That's the world we live in. We do have certain things in common, just living under the same form of organization. Hence, it is such that democracies have ever been spectacles of turbulence and contention, have ever been found incompatible with personal security or the rights of property, and have, in general, been as short in their lives as they have been violent in their deaths. So again, democracies. The American founders, the Constitution is a republic. We do not live in a democracy. It has become democratized over the last 200 years to a large degree, but we're not a democracy. It is a republic, because James Madison's pointing out here that democracies, where everyone goes to the courtyard and votes, they will always be bad to the rights of the individual and people's property rights, and are not long-lived and violent in their deaths. Okay, where's the end of it? Theoretic politicians who have patronized this species of government have erroneously supposed that by reducing mankind to a perfect equality in their political rights, they would, at the same time, be perfectly equalized and assimilate in their possessions, their opinions, and their passions. So he's saying, he's very much more polite to his opponents than Alexander Hamilton. He's basically saying, the Anti-Federalists who are out there, they think if we're all given exactly the same political rights, then we're all going to feel exactly the same, and everything's going to be hunky-dory. We're all going to be on the same team. A republic, by which I mean a government in which the scheme of representation takes place, opens a different prospect and promises the cure for which we are seeking. So again, not a democracy, republic, where we elect representatives to speak on our behalf. We don't all go to the courtyard and raise our hands to vote. We all go to the courtyard to raise our hands to choose someone to go meet with the other courtyard representatives and make a decision. And Madison thinks that a republic is the cure to the problem of faction. Let us examine the points in which it varies from pure democracy, and we shall comprehend both the nature of the cure and the efficacy which it must derive from the union. So if we look at the difference between old-timey democracies and republics, we will see that the union under the Constitution is the best solution. I do want to note, though, that the state governments he was saying was having these problems of tyranny of the majority, as it's become known, they were also republics. So, surprising twist from James Madison. The two great points of difference between a democracy and a republic are, first, the delegation of the government. In the latter, to a small number of citizens elected by the rest. Secondly, the greater number of citizens and greater sphere of country over which the latter might be executed. So the difference between a real pure democracy and a republic are, as we said before, democracy, everyone goes to the courtyard to vote. Republic, they send representatives on their behalf. And in the republic, you can have much more people under one government. Let's see here. The effect of the first difference is, on the one hand, to refine and enlarge the public views by passing them through the medium of a chosen body of citizens, whose wisdom may best discern the true interest of their country, and whose patriotism and love of justice will be least likely to sacrifice it to temporary or partial considerations. So, the real difference between a democracy and a republic is, in a republic, we're choosing someone to represent us, so they'll go and meet, and they'll be thinking about back home. What do they want back home? As opposed to a democracy, we're all in the courtyard. What do I want right now? Right? They also could be, voted out and replaced, which makes them a little bit more nervous to try and grab some power. Under such a regulation, it may well happen that the public voice, pronounced by the representatives of the people, will be more consonant to the public good than if pronounced by the people themselves, convened for the purpose. So, it may well happen. James Madison saying, it's probably, if they all go in a republic and meet, they'll do a better job of consolidating the desires of their particular faction or, village that they're representing. On the other hand, the effect may be inverted. Okay, so, in democracies, it might go the other way. Men of factious tempers, of local prejudices, or of sinister designs may, by intrigue, by corruption, or by other means, first obtain the suffrages, then betray the interests of the people. So, if we're all meeting in the courtyard, Bad Timmy could come around and convince people to vote, his way, and then things go wrong because they're being persuaded by Bad Timmy. Is now my new favorite supervillain that I just made up. Bad Timmy. Okay. The question resulting is whether small or extensive republics are more favorable to the election of proper guardians of the public weal. And it is clearly decided in favor of the latter by two obvious considerations. So he's saying now, we've realized that republics are better than democracies. Now we need to figure out, is a small democracy better or a large democracy? A small republic with lesser people better or a large republic with lots of people better? And this, in number 9, Hamilton had been writing about just this. He was talking about Montesquieu. Many people have been quoting at the time. Many of the Anti-Federalists were saying, we can have a republic, but it needs to be a smaller government. If it's too big, there's too many people, it covers too much land. Well, we just can't. It just won't work. It's too spread out and people will lose their representation and we won't have a free government anymore. It's too easy to be taken over. So James Madison says it is clearly decided in favor of a large population and landmass by obvious considerations. What he thinks are obvious. I'm taking another sip of water. Well, we talk about why it's so obvious that his opponents are incorrect. In the first place, it is to be remarked that, however small the republic may be, the representatives must be raised to a certain number in order to guard against the cabals of a few, and that, however large it may be, they must be limited to a certain number in order to guard against the confusion of a multitude. So, if it's a small government, if it's just a very small amount of people sending representatives, if there's only a few people there, well, then those few people can pretty easily work together to overthrow the government and become, power-hungry mad persons. On the opposite side, if it is too many people, if it is a really big population, then we have to make sure we don't have too many people, what he calls the confusion of multitude. If you have too many people in the government, you have 1,000, 10,000 people in Washington, D.C., all yelling at the same time, that also is just as bad as a few people in charge. So, hence, the number of representatives in the two cases not being in proportion to that of the two constituents and being proportionally greater in the small republic, it follows that if the proportion of fit characters be not less in the large than in the small republic, the former will present a greater option, and consequently a greater probability of a fit choice. So he says the same words a bunch of times in this run-on sentence. So we're going to break that down. The number being not in proportion to the two of the constituents. So in the smaller republic, they are going to need enough people, so it's not just a few people overrunning things. So they have to choose a lot of electors from, or a lot of representatives from each community, and that is similar to the democracy itself, where they all are from the same place, they all have the same ideas, there could be that same scheming that you would see in a small republic. Okay, and also that means, he says fit characters, by which he means people who should be elected. They'll have, smaller republics will have too many open positions, and they'll need to vote for people who probably shouldn't be leaders just because they need to fill the places. As opposed to the larger republic with more people, they have a better chance of having enough good leaders where they can choose from their good leaders and have options of good leaders, leading to a greater probability of a fit choice. Right. One long run-on sentence. In the next place, as each representative will be chosen by a greater number of citizens in the large than in the small republic, it will be more difficult for unworthy candidates to practice with the success the vicious arts by which elections are too often carried, and the suffrages of the people being more free will be more likely to center in men who possess the most attractive merit and the most diffusive and established characters. So, since we have more options, we have, more people per office or per representative spot, it'll be harder for sneaky people to get elected to government because the people have more choices. And because there's more people voting for each person, it's harder for a sneaky person to convince 10,000 people to do something than it is to convince 10 people to do something. So, let's see. It must be confessed that in this, as in most other cases, there is a mean on both sides of which inconveniencies will be found. So, I, James Madison, acknowledge that neither of these situations is absolutely perfect. There are definitely inconveniencies, but by enlarging too much the number of electors, you render the representatives too little acquainted with all their local circumstances and lesser interests, as by reducing it too much, you render him unduly attached to these, and too little fit to comprehend and pursue great and national objects. Real quick, James Madison using the word national. John Jay used the word national. Hamilton did not. One time. A little bit. Kind of. And here James Madison is saying the word national, which is important. By enlarging too much the number of electors, so if you have too many people that you're voting for, they are too distant from their local circumstances. So, again, if 10,000 people vote for one person, that person is certain acquainted with their community of 10,000 people. If 100,000 people are voting for one person, that person is further removed from the people, and therefore will have a harder time determining what they want and less of a reason to care what they want. Okay. The federal constitution forms a happy you know what, before we move on, this is actually one of the major complaints of the Anti-Federalists, this last sentence. A large, that they were saying it's just too large. So like right now, for example, I'm an Anti-Federalist. Pretend I'm an Anti-Federalist. I'm in my state. And I say, I am one of 10,000 people voting for my representative in the state government. And now you want me to be one of 200,000 people voting for one representative all the way over there? They are not going to care about what I want. They're just going to get their little circle of elites and find ways to keep their position and essentially become politicians more than representatives. The federal constitution forms a happy combination in this respect. The great and aggregate interests being referred to the national, the local, and particular to the state legislatures. So, the big, important decisions under the federal constitution are left up to the national government. But for local things, that's for the state governments. We're not going to come tell you how to make fence laws. And I say fence laws particularly because I believe it was the federal farmer is one of the Anti-Federalists who says, like, yes, there's not a lot that the federal government does. They just do taxes and military. So, you know, the most important things, while the states get to make fence laws, essentially. So, I just do want to point that, you know, if you're new here, you might, I've been doing reviews of Anti-Federalist papers for like a year. So I do like to give them their little bit of due along the way. The other point of difference is, oh, and side note, I bring up the Anti-Federalist too because it's important, like, the Federalist papers were written in response to the Anti-Federalist papers, so it's really important to understand both arguments at this time. Anyway, the other point of difference is the greater number of citizens and the extent of territory which may be brought within the compass of Republican than of Democratic government, and it is this circumstance principally which renders factious combinations less to be dreaded in the former than in the later. So here we are, back to factions, the point, political parties, the point of this paper. The greater number of citizens in a Republican government will make it more difficult for factions to arise on a national level because it's too big for national factions to arise. I mean, in hindsight, again, don't talk a lot about modern politics here, but we have two parties. He obviously was wrong. James Madison, clearly wrong. The smaller the society, the fewer probably will be the distinct parties and interests composing it. The fewer the distinct parties and interests, the more frequently will a majority be found of the same party. And the smaller number of individuals composing a majority, the smaller the compass within which they are placed, the more easily they concert and execute their plans of oppression. So, you know, under the state governments, you know, under the federal government, there's so many states and so many people. They're just going to be a lot of different factions and different parties. They're not all going to agree on the same thing. Everyone's going to disagree on almost everything. There will be so many different parties under the Constitution, you won't even be able to handle it. As opposed to what Madison's saying under the state governments, no, there's only going to be 2 or 3, which, to be fair, was the trend at the time. And even in colonial times, many states had like a county and a city party because they had like a county and a city. Basically. But, and there would only be 2 parties. And there weren't a lot of people in the government. So only a few people from one party could, as he says, oppress the other people by doing whatever they want, no matter how it adversely affected them. Extend the sphere, and you take in a greater variety of parties and interests. You make it less probable that a majority of the whole will have a common motive to invade the rights of other citizens. Or, if such a common motive exists, it will be more difficult for all who feel it to discover their own strength and act in unison with each other. So, as I basically just said, so many people over this great landmass, there's no way they're all going to get on the same page. And even if they do feel the same way, then they can't all come together. They're so far apart. They're separated by difference and population. There's no way that national political parties could even emerge under the Constitution. Thanks, James Madison. This actually proves wrong almost immediately because Peter Muhlenberg starts democratic societies, and they take off immediately around the country, and they start mixing with Tammany Hall, which was started by Aaron Burr, actually, within like 2 or 3 years. And that's why Aaron Burr, who was kind of a nobody when the Constitution was written, gets the fourth amount of votes for president when John Adams wins, after Washington leaves. In the span of like 6 years, he goes from nobody to the fourth most popular candidate for president of the United States because he starts a political machine. Besides other impediments, it may be remarked that where there is a consciousness of unjust or dishonorable purposes, communication is always checked by distrust in proportion to the number whose concurrence is necessary. Another wordy sentence. So let's break that down. Forgetting everything else, we should note that when we're aware of someone doing something unjust or dishonorable, communication is always checked by distrust in proportion to the number whose concurrence is necessary. That's a tough... Also, whenever we see someone doing something dishonorable, the communication is checked because people will be distrusting of it. What he's saying here. So when people are doing things that we don't like, there'll be enough people to say, no, stop it. You're being a tyrant. Get out of here. Okay. Hence, it clearly appears that the same advantage which a republic has over a democracy in controlling the effects of faction is enjoyed by a large over a small republic, is enjoyed by the Union over the states composing it. So, in summary, I, James Madison, have proven my point that democracies are going to have factions that are more injurious to the liberties of individuals than a republic, and a large republic will limit the ability for a small handful of conspirators to adversely affect the liberties of the individual and the community as a whole. Does the advantage consist in the substitution of representatives whose enlightened views and virtuous sentiments render them superior to local prejudices and schemes of injustice? So, does the advantage consist in the substitution of representatives superior? So, is it better to have enlightened statesmen who are virtuous and are above your local community problems, which is interesting because he actually said earlier in the paper, we shouldn't assume that enlightened statesmen are going to be better than party at the same time when he's talking about parties being prejudiced. So it's kind of a weird flop there for Madison. It will not be denied that the representation of the Union will be most likely to possess these requisite endowments. So the Constitution is going to solve this problem. Does it consist in the greater security afforded by... Oh yeah, okay, he used the word greater twice. Okay, threw me off. Does it consist in the greater security afforded by a greater variety of parties against the event of any one party being able to outnumber and oppress the rest? So, does the Constitution give us enough variety of parties? Like I said, people like to say that the founders didn't want parties and factions. No, they knew they would happen. They thought the Constitution would protect against it. And this is what Madison's saying right here. He's rhetorically asking himself, does having a huge amount of population, which means a bunch of different political parties all over the place, does that prevent the idea that one party will be big enough across all these different parties to oppress other people and their individuals and the other parties? In an equal degree, does the increased variety of parties comprised within the Union increase the security? So he's answering his rhetorical question. Yes, we are more secure. Does it, in fine, consist... easy for me to say. Does it, in fine, consist in the greater obstacles opposed to the concert and accomplishments of the secret wishes of an unjust and interested majority. So does it help stop big parties from oppressing the smaller ones? Here again, the union, yes, does it. Oh, I forgot. I need to read it. Here again, the extent of the union gives it the more palpable advantage. So yes, he's saying again, he's doing a little bit of a Hamilton here, kind of asking rhetorical questions and repeating them. Although Hamilton would just list questions and not answer his own questions. Quick note about the difference between how Madison and Hamilton write. Hamilton would ask like 10 questions in a row. Madison will ask a question, answer it, ask question, answer it, 3 or 4 times in a row. The influence of factious leaders may kindle a flame within their particular states, but will be unable to spread a general conflagration through the other states. So you might in one state have an oppressive majority that oppresses their people, but they won't have the same interest with the oppressors of other states, so they will have conflicts at the national level. A religious sect may denigrate into a political faction in a part of the Confederacy, but the variety of sects dispersed over the entire face of it must secure the national councils against any danger from that source. So if people form a political party based on an agreed religion, that could happen, but each state has various widely different religions, all mostly forms of Christianity, but they very much were opposed to each other at the time, which is one of the reasons we get freedom of religion later on. It was the sects of Christianity, not other religions. But the variety of sects dispersed. So no, again, he's saying no, too many people. There's no way that they'll unite into national political parties. A rage for paper money, for an abolition of debts, for an equal division of property, or for any other improper or wicked project will be less apt to pervade the whole body of the Union than a particular member of it, in the same proportion as such a malady is more likely to taint a particular county or district than an entire state. So, right here, James Madison is he's playing on the fears of the wealthy. Like all the rest of the Federalist Papers and Anti-Federalist Papers, these are propaganda pieces that are trying to convince the people to think a certain way. Specifically, they're trying to get the people who are property owners who can vote for representatives in the ratification convention to vote the way he wants them to vote. And he is saying a rage for paper money, which often scares the wealthy and was, again, paper money riots in New Hampshire, Shays Rebellion wanted paper money, like it was a common thing at the time. An abolition of debts, so just to get rid of the debts, an equal division of property, or any other improper or wicked project. He's basically talking about communism here before it was really a thing. And the only person talking about it, he wouldn't be talking about it yet, but Thomas Paine would write in Agrarian Justice, one of his books, basically talk about something like this. Kind of like universal income, actually, is what Paine would talk about. But either way, he's saying they're going to want to take your money and divide it equally. No, as he's been saying this whole time, Madison said we need to protect our property, even though some people have more and some people have less. And it's less likely to happen across all the people of the Union than in just one state. Now, this is a really telling part here. He's been concerned this whole time with the tyranny of majority and talking about political parties. He mentioned it briefly at the beginning about how, rich people and poor people will naturally form different parties. And here he's basically saying the Union will protect from, if all the poor people get together and say things are not going well, you need to find a way to circulate the currency, because you put a currency into circulation to circulate. We need to find a way to put the currency to circulate the currency. The Union will stop all the poor people from getting together and telling us what to do. Now, this is not the entire point of the paper. The entire point of the paper is any majority that he thinks that this wide variety, this large group of people will prevent national parties at all. And here he's kind of saying the quiet part out loud, where he's saying, like, there's no way. We've had revolts in Massachusetts and New Hampshire and Pennsylvania, and many states are starting to revolt over some of the debts and rage for paper money, which is interesting because some of the founders did want paper money. Many of them didn't. But either way, this will help us keep the status quo. This is a really interesting sentence here. All right, we're closing it on the end. Let's see how it winds up. In the extent and proper structure of the Union, therefore, we behold a Republican remedy for the diseases most incident to a Republican government. So, under the Constitution, it is the perfect solution to the fears of a free government being corrupted. And according to the degree of pleasure and pride we feel in being Republicans, ought to be our zeal in cherishing the spirit and supporting the character of Federalists. So, according to the degree and pleasure and pride we feel in being Republicans, ought to cherish the character. So we are Republicans and we love freedom. And because we love freedom and we don't want a tyranny of the majority, we should support the Constitution. Publius. And it's very interesting. This is the first time you see the word Federalist. And again, I will remind you, the Anti-Federalists considered themselves Federalists because they wanted a confederation. They accused the Federalists of being really pretend Federalists, literally is what Brutus called them. Brutus, I think it was Brutus called them pretend Federalists. Either way, they were nationalists, or they were consolidating the government, and the Anti-Federalists looked at them as nationalists, not Federalists, but there we go. And there it is. Federalist number 10. One of the most important political pamphlets in the history of the United States. Where, just to sum up, James Madison says, yeah, there are going to be political parties. There are going to be factions. There is nothing we can do to stop that from happening without limiting the freedoms of the people or making them all robots that are exactly the same. So we have to account for that and minimize the effects. The best way to minimize the effects is to have a republic instead of a democracy, so we can choose representatives who aren't just in the courtyard getting yelled at. And the more people, the better, because we can choose better representatives. We'll have a better pool to choose from, and because with so many people, the idea of one or two political parties forming is impossible. There's too many wide variety of different opinions. So we'll just have lots of little political parties all over the place. Despite how important and influential this particular paper is, really the foundation of American political thought, it could be argued, without talking about modern politics at all, I can say he's totally wrong. We have the Democrats and the Republicans. And not only that, but it happened almost immediately. It happened like I said, with Peter Muhlenberg, like a few years later, James Madison becomes part of the Republican Party, as they call themselves. We now call them the Democratic Republicans or the Jeffersonian Republicans. He was part of that. Like, less than a decade after he's writing these papers. Well, about a decade. So either way, that is Federalist number 10. I hope you enjoyed. If you did, do me a favor and hit like. If you made it through an hour and a half, hit like for me. And if you're new here, subscribe. I do live read-alongs like this all the time, 1 to 3 days a week until months from now when we're done. I also put out Anti-Federalist papers every Friday where I discuss those. And on my website, Founder of the Day, and right here on YouTube, I publish a different short video or article about the American Revolution. So I hope you enjoyed. If you did, thank you so much. If you didn't, thanks anyway. And I will be back with another Founder for you tomorrow.